And this evening we're delighted to welcome Professor David Martin, who, as you know, has been very much one of the major pioneers of secularization studies in this country since the early 1960s. Professor Martin was previously Professor of Sociology at LSE for 27 years, in fact, from 1962 until 1989, and he's currently Honorary Professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Lancaster University. So tonight we've got a quite controversial and provocative title that Professor Martin is going to speak to us about. Does science make secularization inevitable? Professor Martin.
Well, it is a privilege and a pleasure and a shock for me to be giving the Templeton lecture on this particular topic. I recollect that my physics paper largely consisted of suggestions that the examiner read my essay on Schopenhauer and Wagner. So perhaps physics wasn't absolutely my top topic. But I've had some problems with this thing here, and we've got a specially scientifically arranged thing which will help me to manage to cope with the paper. So thank you again for inviting me to this lecture. Does the advance of science mean secularization? I have a complicated brief because this issue is bedeviled by the way people talk about religion and the secular, and latterly secularism, as if they knew some essential meaning attached to the terms they use. Same is true for science. It's also bedeviled by the way some educated people talk about what they believe ought to be the case, as though their belief could stand in for what actually is the case. Ought has become is, on the basis of certain historic crises in the relation of science to religion, which have acquired an almost mythic status. In spite of recent revisionist history, for example, the writings of John Brooke at Oxford. I'm thinking here, of course, of the Galileo controversy, of what Paul Azar called the crisis in the European mind from the late 17th to the early 18th century, and the continuing controversy over Darwin. As a result, you may expect me to revisit the philosophical issues involved, for example, about the status and freedom of humanity, when, for the purposes of this lecture, I am most of the time simply a sociologist. However, being simply a sociologist is not as simple as it seems, because I have to begin by explaining what we do and do not take seriously with respect to theories of secularization. That explanation does not involve jargon, but it does involve a rapid dive into the inwardness of sociology with respect to concepts and procedures. That includes what's bound to look like a ragbag of different kinds of explanation, from the advent of the car to the political alienation of the working class to the long-term processes of rationalization. That doesn't make for easy writing or easy listening. Particularly awkward here is the distinction between science as a mode of understanding and the indirect consequences of science and technology for our everyday lives. I'm assuming my brief is to discuss the impact of the former, the mode of understanding. Yet sociological theories of secularization are more concerned inter alia with the latter. The classic procedure of sociology in the absence of controlled experiment is cross-cultural comparison. So the core of what I argue has to turn on something so obvious, so crucial, and to my mind so compelling, that it is a sociological question as to why educated people do not take it on board. In terms of cross-cultural, that is, cross-national comparison, countries at roughly the same level with regard to scientific advance have religious profiles pretty well across the complete range. But that means I have to offer explanation in terms of different histories, almost indeed in terms of different cultural gestalten. I set such general tendencies to secularization as may exist, other things being equal, against the contingencies of history and against the particularities of cultural context where things hardly ever are equal. I also have to engage in informed speculation about mental space, asking whether we, or some of us, entertain mental spaces where there is an either-or, as between science and religion, or whether a mental space is a manifold where we call upon different kinds and levels of discourse and understanding, according both to our individual context and to the degree of openness or closure of mental space made available to us by our culture, especially our national culture. I also have briefly to discuss the kind of religious mutations brought about by modernity, apart from straightforward secularization, and the emergence or re-emergence in our recent modernity of magic, of spirituality, and of what Paul Helas and Linda Woodhead call re-sacralization. Finally, I have to bring into the open a theme implicit throughout, which is the power of master narratives, especially the Enlightenment master narrative. Its power to occlude our understanding of what is sociologically obvious in favor of an obvious but false hypothesis about religion receding as science advances. The French think master narratives have had their day, but in my view, that only tells us they have lost the plot. Our intellectual histories of the relationship of science and religion, and our dubious assumptions about the avant-garde, not only obscure the actual data about secularization at the level of people at large, but actually ensure we are in a state of principled ignorance about our global reality. That is why it keeps surprising us. Sir Bob Geldof, himself an atheist, has just reminded us, we do not understand what is happening globally unless we understand religion. Waiting for the world to play catch-up with France and Sweden is a mug's game. So much for my awkward brief as regards the recession of religion with the advance of science. As I've hinted, my colleagues in the field of the sociology of religion, for example, Grace Davey, Steve Bruce and James Beckford in the United Kingdom, might well regard rebuttal of so crass an idea as precious time and energy misspent. Putting it mildly, this is what the late Imre Lakatos, philosopher of science, would have called a radically deteriorating research program. Once upon a time, somewhat before Darwin, many human scientists had their own evolutionary schemes where something of this sort might have been seriously entertained. No longer. Its last representative, to my knowledge, was the late Baroness Barbara Wootton in the 50s. It was her confident affirmation of an either-or with respect to social science and religion, let alone natural science, that forced me to think furiously about why what was obviously true to her was obviously false. What then do sociologists of religion take seriously? They take seriously the privatization of religion. What do sociologists of religion take seriously? They take seriously the privatization of religion, although not everybody is convinced about it, as one discovers on reading José Casanova's impressive rebuttal, Public Religions in the Modern World. What the privatization of religion refers to is its declining social significance for public rhetoric, legitimation, debate, and policy. A recent example might be Alastair Campbell's advice to the Prime Minister when he was about to address soldiers destined to Iraq: "We don't do God." Sociologists also take seriously an approach closely implicated in privatization, which stresses individualization. According to this approach, we each and all put together our own personal bricolage of religious attitudes and ideas and build our own individual spiritual pathway. An example of this might be a comment of one of the Beatles: "Why should 10,000 people believe the same thing?" At this point, I have to tip a ragbag of items from the repertoire of theories onto the floor. There is the effect of geographical and social mobility in breaking up dense communal relations permeated by religion and in breaking up the unity of the generations. There is a consumer hedonism inimical to long-term commitments of any kind and unwilling to invest time and energy in maintaining institutions, religious or otherwise. There are the rival attractions of a picnic in the car, or Sunday morning football for under 13s, or weekend entertainment in front of the television. There is the impact of secular control of education and the media, so that even personnel employed by the church or in church schools make preemptive strikes in favour of secular criteria and values alien to religion. Then, in the longer historical perspective, there is the displacement of religious solidarity by national solidarity or the claims of party political ideology. It's not easy to turn these assorted ideas and influences into a joined-up sociological narrative. But they clearly have little to do with the impact of science, unless we're thinking of the effect of the car and of television as among the indirect consequences of invention. Sociologists also take seriously their empirical indices and their basic organizing frameworks, such as rationalization and social differentiation. I've already mentioned the organizing framework of privatization and do not intend to pursue that further. As for empirical indices, religious belief and practice are routinely correlated with age, generation, gender, status, occupation, education, urbanization, and so on, to produce patterns of change. However, the crude data are not entirely self-interpreting, so that you have to put questions to them, such as how far a decline in female practice is due to changing female lifestyles. Or one can ask why it is that, according to Andrew Greeley, any association that may have existed between advanced education and irreligion has virtually disappeared in the youngest European generation. If we find with Rodney Stark that natural scientists and technologists are more religious than practitioners of the humanities and social sciences, that certainly seems to nudge us away from any idea that hard science is incompatible with religion. Stark's data show that the least scientific disciplines are the most irreligious, coming to a climax in my own subject of sociology, and that irreligion does not increase with increasing exposure to the hard sciences. We come now to our two crucial organizing frameworks for discussing secularization: rationalization and social differentiation. You will first of all notice that we've entered an intellectual world dominated by schemata and nouns of process ending in ation. Nouns of process have a way of implying movement from state A, which is religious, to state B, which is secular. So do schemata, like the shift from community to association. That way, we find ourselves tilted on a historical slope, where any particular religious present is pregnant with a secular future. Michael Wheeler, in his study of the religion of John Ruskin, complains of precisely this way of thinking and shows how unjust it is when trying to understand Ruskin. Another version of this approach is Herbert Butterfield's Whig interpretation of history. Clearly, we are now beginning to canvass the way progressive master narratives govern our perception of historical change. I come to these master narratives later, only pausing to notice there are other master narratives of rotation, such as Sorokin's ideational and sensate periods, or narratives of decline, such as Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West. Rationalization is a concept we owe to Max Weber, and in his work it can be as much part of a narrative of decline towards the iron cage as it is a narrative of progress. It does not refer to the advance of abstract reason, but rather to the consequences of increasing technical efficiency in rendering the world both impersonal and disenchanted. Here we can pick up some of the indirect consequences of science. For example, when we consider the increasingly rational and bureaucratic way in which we today organize health. Once there were hospitals named after St. Bartholomew or St. Thomas, but that religious frame has now been hollowed out, and the sense of a vocation to heal is now confined to the private motivations of individual carers and doctors. Clearly, health is a sphere where the white coat of medical science is most pure and most respected. On the other hand, the grey suits of health bureaucrats and administrators are less pure and less respected. The advance of rational bureaucracy was very much a theme developed by the late Brian Wilson. And for him, it belonged to a narrative of bleak decline. As a major theorist of secularization, he envisaged a regression from the personal, communal, religious, and conscientious to the impersonal, fragmented, irreligious, and demoralized. Once again, this has little directly to do with the advance of science, at least of natural science, but it is significant that an agnostic should so bravely enter this fraught and contentious area to risk the coals of fire prepared for anyone linking the decline of religion to the decline of morality, or personal responsibility, or conscientiousness. The counter-arguments are obvious and have recently been made by Paul Gregory. Is the contemporary United States so obviously virtuous? Was the England portrayed in Hogarth's The Rake's Progress or in Jacobean drama, so obviously responsible and clean living? Here enter the criminologist and sociologist of morality, Christy Davis, and his impressively documented The Strange Death of Moral Britain, 2004. He plots the indices of the decline of religion against moral and criminal indices, fully alive to all the caveats and personally conscious of both gains and losses. His focus is the same as Brian Wilson's. That is the 19th century rise in Britain of a personally responsible and conscientious kind of religion, propagated by the Sunday school, voluntary charitable organizations, and voluntary youth organizations, and the parallel onset of modernity. Different commentators date the moment when this declined differently, but Christy Davis and the historian Simon Green agree on the trend. The point is that any correlation between fewer enrollments in Sunday schools and greater knowledge of the special theory of relativity are adventitious. Christy Davy relates these parallel changes to a shift from moral to causalist understandings of human behavior that owes something to social science and maybe genetics, as well as to a utilitarianism shifting from principles of moral justice to principles of minimum harm. Again, the gains and losses are obvious, and I do not think anyone can be unaware of what has happened, since even criminals themselves are expert manipulators of we're sick, we are sociologically sick. The social scientific translation of a Christian vocabulary relating to forgiveness and victimage is also pretty clear here. Philip Reef has written eloquently of the triumph of the therapeutic, and I recently heard the family of Herod the Great cosily described from the pulpit as dysfunctional. So much for sin is all obvious. Yet, sociology should maintain its usual reservations about the obvious here, where it is sociology itself that seems to corrode religious language. When I hear young people referring to the apparently demoralized worlds in which they so often live, I hear expressions and judgments about bastard and inappropriate behavior which are saturated in morality. Even my social work relatives and friends resort to moral judgments outside the immediate environment of what is clearly a moral vocation. As for the close neighbours of dysfunctional families, their comments are downright theological. These are families from and going to hell. Therapeutic language persistently gravitates back to moral evaluation, so that the adjective pathological is a judgment posing as a description. Of course, morality can be separated from religion, both with respect to individual behaviour and in the context of moral philosophy. That is not at issue. Nor am I suggesting that any inherent limit on the erasure of moral language is necessarily linked to an inherent limit on the erasure of religious language. I am saying, however, that religious language is bound at the hip to moral language, and that moral language of itself throws up analogues of religious understandings, such as the gratuitous, the redemptive, the salutary, and the justified, as well as locutions implying vertical as well as horizontal dimensions. As a matter of mere observation, I doubt whether either social or genetic determinism can erase the links implicit in linguistic usages. My discussion of rationalization has, following Brian Wilson, included the role of technically efficient and impersonal means in relation to morality. I now turn to social differentiation, which is my own primary framework for analysing secularisation, though you will notice the extent to which the two overlap. In my view, social differentiation, while bringing about certain convergences on the secular, also allows room for the historical particularity and cultural contingency on which I also place great emphasis. The concept of social differentiation has roots in the increasing division of labour and refers to the increasing autonomy of semi-discrete sectors of social life. One by one, these sectors, for example, law, social control, social legitimation, communication, health, education, acquire their own proper autonomy from ecclesiastical regulation and influence, and from religious modes of thinking. Theology is no longer the automatic queen of sciences. And just as we are all aware of the impact of rationalization, so we are all aware of social differentiation in relation to the autonomy, sometimes the conflict of teacher vis-à-vis priest, in relation to the secular therapist vis-à-vis the priestly cure of souls, and in relation to the dilemmas sometimes faced by health professionals in Catholic hospitals or Catholic doctors in secular hospitals. If I wanted to pick a small example about how both rationalization and social differentiation offered evidence of the indirect consequences of science, I might choose the partial edging out of the theologian on public bodies concerned with bioethics by philosophers or by theologians talking philosophically. Fundamentally, I see that change as part of a liberal claim to exercise universal objective jurisdiction as against all particular modes of thought and interest. Jürgen Habermas, in my view, rightly suspects this claim, specifically in relation to religion. But it's not clear to me what the alternative might be, especially given that liberalism is so often a Judeo-Christian mutation, as both John Gray and Charles Taylor have argued. Since I believe social differentiation allows for historical and cultural contingency and for variability, I need to offer an illustration, and it's this. The order in which different cultural sectors are differentiated varies historically, and the partial and then absolute separation of church and state in the United States had momentous consequences for religion from 1750 to the present day, so that American religious practice and belief rose all the way through the period of modernization. By contrast, the late separation of church and state and/or church and elite in Western Europe had momentous negative consequences for religion, still working themselves out today. I also happen to believe that rationalization is equally inflected by history and culture. Having lived in Dallas, Texas, which is simultaneously one of the most rationalized and religious metroplexes in the world. But rationalization is patient of a much more universalizing treatment at the expense of historical particularity. There are those who, perhaps rather ethnocentrically, see post-Protestant Sweden and post-Catholic France as templates of a universal future. It might be nice, but I suspect ought and desire have once again run ahead of is and historical plausibility. Iraq like Sweden? Who, at least here, would not say amen to that? A dangerous pause. So far then, we have looked at some of the variables sociologists take seriously, at empirical indices and interpretive frameworks like privatization, rationalization, and social differentiation. We've insinuated worries about historically tilted slopes, Whig interpretations of history, and the extent to which we are working within master narratives, particularly Enlightenment ones, and even maybe Kuhnian paradigms. The way looks clear from my presentation of cross-cultural and cross-national data showing no consistent relation between the degree of scientific advance and a reduced profile of religious influence, belief, and practice. However, in a way all too typical of my sociological drive, I need first to step back for an essential point about sociological interpretation, at least as I position myself in the tradition of Verstehen, or understanding, and Geisteswissenschaften, or cultural sciences, as expounded by Max Weber and Wilhelm Dilthey. I emphasize understanding of signs as much as explanation of indices. For our purposes, I do that in the context of the depth and ambiguity of signs, in particular language, and the expansive manifold of mental space. Social analysis exemplifies for me emergent properties of action in the human universe, not present in the physical or biological universes, but eminently illustrated in the structure of motives and of the constraints of options and alternatives for action in drama. It's called the dramaturgical approach. Clearly, the depth and ambiguity of symbols, signs, especially language, and the manifold character of mental space bear quite directly on any notion of a zero-sum relation between science and religion. In mental space, there is no such necessary either-or, because many different modes of ideation and discourse can be entertained simultaneously and selectively drawn upon according to context. And beyond that, the degree of openness or the degree of closure in mental space itself varies culturally, as between, for example, the constricted one-dimensional space of the former DDR, where either-or prevails, and the rather conspicuously wide-open spaces of the United States, where angels, UFOs, and aliens happily cohabit with rocket science. Allow me to press further this matter of the nature of mental space and to illustrate our recourse to different kinds of concept and discourse according to context. At a very simple level, there is, for example, no difficulty about saying your life in their hands, emphasizing the autonomy of medical science and the doctor, and he's got the whole world in his hands, emphasizing our dependence on profound, perhaps undergirding or overarching spiritual resources. What, however, of the difference between great is truth and shall prevail, and you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free, or I am the way, the truth, and the life? Here we enter into the phenomenology of being and freedom. I am not starting a discussion of being and freedom or of the nature of language games here, but only stressing the kinds and levels of discourse with which sociological observation has to deal if it's to do justice to complexity. There is more to sociology than causation, correlation, jargon, inverted commas, and hobnail boots. Now for my cross-cultural data. I'm going to stay in the main with three revolutionary, scientifically advanced and rationalized societies, each with a widely different religious profile. I shall make one or two further observations, in particular about two other scientifically advanced and rationalized societies, Uruguay and Singapore, one where Christmas does not happen, even except privately, and the other where everything happens in public and in private. The USA. From a socio-historical perspective, the United States, founded on the basis of an Anglo-Protestant pluralism, experienced a relatively friendly relation between religion and enlightenment. For example, the overlap of Episcopalianism and Masonry. Subsequent migration brought yet more Lutherans, Catholics, Jews, and others for whom religion was an anchor of distinct and sometimes regional identity in the American melting pot. Popular religion and the Enlightenment and elite Enlightenment mostly cooperated to support an inclusive civic nationalism. This was progressively based on common citizenship rather than an organic, exclusive nationalism of ethnicity and language. That process came to an interim conclusion in the 1960s with the civil rights movement. But the culture wars since the 1960s have not severed the ties of a common culture for black and for white, for Hispanic and Anglo alike. By European standards, these culture wars are mere skirmishes. France and Quebec. In France and in Quebec, matters have been quite otherwise. In Quebec, an organic, ethno-religious and linguistic nationalism emerged, persisting up to the 60s, when religion and linguistic nationalism, to some extent, went their separate ways. Religious practice dropped dramatically, as it did in Holland over the same period. In France itself, a civic and linguistic nationalism established by revolutionary violence warred against a religiously informed organic nationalism. The climax came after 1870 with the Third Republic. Religious practice began to fall, church and state were separated in 1905, and laïcité has been dominant ever since. I need only mention one more difference, which is between the decentralized governance of the United States and the centralization, particularly of education, in France. Decentralization inhibits attempts at ideological monopoly by secular elites in the United States, where they are relatively unimportant, whereas centralization assists monopoly by secularist elites in France, where they are important. Where else did the term bien-pensant come from? As for East Germany, the former DDR, centralization reached its apogee under the enlightened and secularist dictatorship 1945 to 89, following the pagan interlude of Blood and Soil 1933 to 45. Modernization was dramatically held back and active religion reduced to a small minority, in spite of the fact that a Stasi-infiltrated church was everywhere the springboard for bringing down the dictatorship in 1989. A third case. What now of irreligious Uruguay and riotously religious Singapore? Uruguay is a fairly simple case, given that the Reds more or less beat the Whites, and the maximum immigration from Europe coincided with maximum church-state tension in the sending countries, Spain and Italy. A secularist university was created, producing an elite for a Latin country that does not even acknowledge Christmas. Uruguay is also more than 80% urban. Singapore is less simple, but clearly represents one of the most urban, multicultural and rationalized countries in the world. Religion in Singapore has been state-controlled in a rather neo-Confucian manner to underwrite the values of national cohesion and development. The changes in religion over the period of modernization include some separating out of the rich, syncretic and animistic mulch from classical Buddhism, an expansion among the socially mobile of a personal, close-knit, almost cellular form of Christianity, and straight secularity. And I want to stress that this separating out and this rise of a consciously personal religion is rather characteristic of modernizing societies, as it was characteristic of a modernizing Europe. One finds similar changes in Brazil, Turkey, and Indonesia. In an 80% Muslim country like Indonesia, highly educated women adopt the hitherto rare practice of wearing the headscarf as a sign of modernity and a protest against syncretism. Unfortunately, the concentration in our Western media on fundamentalism as a reaction against modernity completely neglects this alliance of Islam with modernity, as well as a similar alliance throughout the developing world between Christianity, hygiene, education, technology, and transnational connections. Only in our traditional ex-Christendom or among nationalist intelligentsias elsewhere is that connection not understood or else condemned as disturbing traditional lifestyles. The assumption is that one can opt out of change and the global reality, keeping traditional culture intact for the tourist gaze and even the anthropological gaze. As one aspiring and teetotal Pentecostal in Ecuador said to the anthropologist, "Did you expect me to wear feathers, miss?" I pause to emphasize the crucial variable implicit in all the considerations so far put forward. That variable is the role of the church and or religion in relation to cultural distance and or disparities of political power and establishment. I pause also to pursue the comparison and the contrast between Western Europe and the United States with regard to a couple of related contemporary developments. They are the return of magic and the rise of spirituality that Helas and Woodhead speak of as re-sacralization. Régis Debray, in his extraordinary biography of God over the last 3,000 years, claims that the twilight of the gods is morning for the magicians. That is a phenomenon present both in Western Europe and the United States. However, in Western Europe, there is a negative relation between Christianity and magic. Indeed, a further separating out of the two by modernity, at least north of the Mediterranean littoral. Whereas in the wide open spaces of the United States, the gods and the magicians enjoy high noon together. The same applies to spirituality. In Western Europe, spirituality, with art and music as further sources of consolation and inspiration, is often encountered outside the churches. Spirituality tends to offer an alternative to faith, as it does, for example, in Germany. However, in the United States, according to Robert Wathnow, spirituality and faith mostly move together. That I put down quite simply to my key variable, the way religion in the United States adapts to every cultural level in the context of a pervasive reliance on voluntary association, federalism, and a religious pluralism with no specific institutional connection between a church and the state, or between elite power and culture. The contrast between 1 and sometimes 2 centuries of the erosion of established Christendom in Western Europe is very clear. For complex reasons concerned with Ottoman domination and secular post-World War II dictatorships imposed by the Soviet Union, the situation in Eastern Europe has been patchily different. The dictatorships successfully suppressed religion in the DDR, the Czech Republic, and Estonia. However, in Greece, Romania, and Serbia, and now in Russia, the revival of Eastern Orthodoxy is very evident, in spite of quasi-monopoly and a de facto or de jure establishment. The ethno-religious sentiments of repressed nations are very powerful. While in Russia, a failed ideology has given place to an age-old union of faith and nation. And whereas elsewhere one observes a separating out of magic and religion with the onset of modernity, that is not exactly evident in Eastern Europe. In Greece, where I was recently, one finds a startling degree of iconic protection and spiritual insurance available, together with the belief in the devil only rivaled in the United States. Given Greek history, it's not difficult to see why, but plainly the advance of science is not much of a factor. I suggest the pictures I have offered of modern and rapidly modernizing societies, from the United States to Russia, do not say much for any hypothesis about the decline of religiosity with the advance of science, at least so far as science is received by people at large. What matters is the reception of science and technology with respect to religion, not some intellectual history of the relationships generated in the academy. The key lies in reception theory. And it's notable that hardly anyone, even Owen Chadwick in his splendid The Secularisation of the European Mind in the 19th Century, has brought together the social or popular history of religion and the intellectual history of ideas. Charles Taylor is a rare exception. In the academy, or in what Peter Berger calls global faculty club culture, too many of us, including theologians, rely on the intellectual history of ideas to understand religion and secularization. Only this can explain why my late admired colleague, Ernest Gellner, sometime professor of anthropology at Cambridge, should upbraid me for describing the United States as religious, given its intellectual representatives were people like Richard Rorty and John Rawls. Intellectual history remains affected by a master narrative, treating religion too often as inchoate and backward superstition, or as pathetic froth obscuring the surface of the real until blown away by revolution. Intellectual history is also too closely wedded to what John Waitman analysed in his The Concept of the Avant-Garde. It's not that the concept of the avant-garde never applies, but that it's dangerous when taken for granted. It seems to me that the avant-garde in the Romantic and antinomian 1890s has gradually extended its influence down the social scale, first between the two world wars and then in the 60s. On the other hand, Louis Menand's account of the Metaphysical Club, in the Metaphysical Club, of the secularization inaugurated in the United States by the move to philosophical pragmatism is only an irrelevant fifth wheel as concerns the religious history of Americans as a people. Theirs is a religious practicality, not a philosophical pragmatism. There is one particular and virulent version of the Enlightenment master narrative that has had some modest popular success, though even more implausible than the idea that religion recedes as science advances. It gains a hearing, in part, because it combines the idea of scientific truth dispersing religious error with the idea of scientific truth and innocent virtue dispersing religious error and culpable vice. The appeal of this coupling comes less from any popular dismay about inadequacies in the argument from design than from a popular unease about a seeming association of religion with violence and intolerance. The link between error and evil, whether promoted by eminent scientists or over pints in pubs, seems plausible. And it could take more time to disperse through sociological analysis than I have available here. It depends on a naive pointing at facts in Northern Ireland, the Middle East, or wherever, backed up by a studied neglect of the way religion does and does not mesh with power and the dynamics of power. There is also a studied neglect of an obvious process whereby a society partly converted, say, to Christianity, in turn partly converts Christianity to its own social structures, whether they are feudal, mercantile, capitalist, whatever. It happens there is no continuing Enlightenment institution comparable to the Church in secular contexts available for negative comment on the corruptions of power. And that means Torquemada can be held up as a real Christian, exemplifying faith, deploying political power, whereas Joseph Stalin cannot be held up as exemplifying secular enlightenment in power because he was not really enlightened. Again, Christianity can be blamed for what happened when adopted as the faith of the Roman Empire, whereas Darwinism can wash its hands as though innocent of what happened when converted into social Darwinism or deployed by Nietzsche. Yet the metaphors of Darwinism are decidedly more susceptible to malign conversion than the metaphors of Christianity. Claims to historical innocence are always suspect, whoever makes them. It is this sort of analysis, if this sort of analysis does have any resonance, promoted as it is by biologists and geneticists skiing off-piste in the human sciences, it raises the possibility that religion might recede, however mildly, not with the advance of scientific truth, but with the promotion of scientific error. It is worth adding that those scientific theories which build religion into our mental basement as a neurological program acquired in remote prehistory to assist our survival appear to restrict secularization on scientific or maybe pseudoscientific grounds rather severely. In Pascal Boyer's rendering of emissions from the mental basement, only the hyper-intelligent can escape religion, an idea with obvious attractions for members of the faculty club. Religion remains immortal, at least among the Untermenschen. Lord Winston, the eminent gynecologist, is now publishing a book about God, sympathetically attempting to bridge the gap between science and religion by showing how religion has been built into the psyche for our better adaptation and survival. However, he also notes quite correctly that if that were so, we ought all to be religious. Whether that explains why the neurotransmitters of religion have been turned off in East Germany, or are blazing away in the United States, or are strongly on for over half the population of South Korea and simply off for the rest, remains mysterious. Sociology is a humble affair, and definitely not constructed after the model of rocket science or quantum mechanics. That is because it is a subject with a human subject matter. It does, however, operate within certain evidential constraints, and I hope that within those constraints I've offered considerations undermining the idea that religion recedes as science advances. At least, if I were an atheist anxious to disturb the faith of an intelligent young friend, I would recommend a course in biblical criticism, penny plain and tuppence coloured, or in psychobabble and sociobabble, or, best of all, a vigorous drench in romantic literary Weltschmerz, but not, definitely not, a bracing course in astrophysics. He or she might rather too easily suppose that he or she was tracing the mind of the Maker. Thank you very much.